Welcome into Lessons from Living. I am your host, Beth Graham, and I am beyond delighted that you are with me today. I have said those words or something resembling those words 100 times now. And the reason that I am particularly excited that you join me here today is that with the publication of this episode, we will have reached 100 episodes today. I know I told you that this week we would have Stacey Glass back, but instead, the conclusion to her episode will be featured next week. I just couldn't let this week go by without personally speaking to you and sharing with you about this podcast and all these episodes that we have worked to produce on your behalf and what it has meant to me over the course of these years. You may remember this, or you may never have seen it, but the original vision for this podcast was to feature ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things. They could be accomplishing something remarkable or overcoming something particularly difficult. They could be living a life of significance by giving back to others. There's so many different ways that someone can live an inspiring life. And I believe we have showcased the broad range of these types of lives over these 100 episodes. The original inspiration for this podcast was actually the young man whose episode is number one. Will Reynolds. My daughter is friends with Will, and she came home one day and told me the story of how he intended to give his kidney to a friend dying of kidney disease. I thought to myself, everyone should hear this story, particularly young people in this day and age. They need to know that there are people in this world and in their generation, particularly, who are as selfless as this young man who was willing to give up an integral part of his body at 22. Will was generous enough to share his story, and with that first interview, the podcast was born. Since then, we have talked to dozens and dozens of people who have lived these remarkable lives that I am describing. Recently, I went back and listened to some of the original episodes. It was so fun. Some of the very earliest ones. I'm trying to compile all of the lessons from living that these guests have shared as key factors that have marked their own lives. And I wanted to be able to offer this as a gift to you, our listeners. So I went back and began the process of revisiting and listening to some of the earliest episodes. And it just struck me how precious these people are who I have had the privilege of interviewing over the course of these years. They are simply remarkable people. I'm sure you feel the same. And it was fun to go back in time and hear their voices again and think about all of the things that we've talked about and all of the values that they have taught me over the life of this podcast. So watch for that list because I think you will all enjoy having it. I kind of wish we'd started this originally because it's a lot of work to go back and seek those parts of the recordings out now, but we will get it done for you. And hopefully in the future, I will keep better track of them as we go. But it was such a gift to go back in time and bear witness to this body of work. And I started thinking about that original vision for the podcast and was measuring in my mind whether we had hit the mark and whether we are continuing to hit the mark. I love the idea of interviewing ordinary people. The honest challenge in doing so is to find those stories. And that has been the hardest part of this podcast work, finding those stories about ordinary people. Some of my personal friends and listeners, and I really consider all of you my personal friends, probably no need to even make that distinction. Y'all have been so wonderful about referring me to people you encounter in your lives, people whose stories resonated with you to the extent that you feel like I did with that original story, that someone needs to hear this. Everyone should hear this. But it has been a challenge to find enough stories to feature over the course of 100 episodes. The other challenge in featuring ordinary people is that they often are not receptive to being interviewed. They're often very humble people who don't even believe that their story is anything special and certainly not worth featuring on a podcast. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to convince a person like that, yes, we all need to hear your story. It really is a challenge. So, first, let me make a note here in this episode that if you are a regular listener and you want to help the show, one of the biggest ways that you can help the show is to share with me those stories about ordinary people in your orbit, those who you encounter in your everyday life. If you find yourself thinking, this story needs to be shared, that is the number one biggest way you can help the show. So, to the degree that we've been able to find stories about ordinary people, I think we've been true to our original vision. Where I think we have perhaps strayed from that original vision is in this way. When a podcast reaches a certain level of notoriety, people start to come to you with their stories. And while I make it clear that I am not in the business of promoting anything, oftentimes these folks have a book that they've written or platform that they are developing. And let me just say, I have significant rules about books. First of all, I want to have read it before I recommend it to you. Many of you know that I'm an English major and I'm very critical of the things that I personally read, much less recommend to my friends. I consider it a hard and fast rule that I want to read a book before I recommend it. And sometimes potential guests are disappointed because I have a stack of books I have to read before agreeing to share their stories. However, just because someone has used their experience to develop a platform to share their story, I don't think that they should be discounted from being a guest on Lessons from Living. Their stories are still amazing. Another one of the problems that has been particularly challenging for me to navigate is that some of the guests who are in this category I'm talking about may have done a number of podcasts before, and they might have a certain way of sharing their story. I've had potential guests say, well, this is how I open, and this is the way I tell my story, and this is the format I like to use. And I'll tell them, look, this has to be a conversation. I don't want to do it the way that you've done it before. If you have other podcasts that feature you in the same way, there's no point in me putting something out there that is identical to what you've already done. I want to ask questions that no one else has asked. I want to approach your story from a new perspective. Some of them don't like that. And honestly, if they don't, they are not a good fit for Lessons from Living. So I have turned down a number of people for this reason. I've also turned down a number of authors whose book is simply not well written or worth reading. And that sounds harsh, I realize, but this method of handling this new kind of guest has worked really well for the show. I've actually had some guests say that they've never been asked questions like I asked them. I had one guest on the show who had been on 160 podcasts, and he said, I've never been interviewed like you just interviewed me. I consider that a win. But you can see how there are challenges inherent in sharing stories about people who have shared their stories before, even though those stories come to you freely. I'd be curious to hear from you whether you have sensed a shift in the podcast over the years. My personal preference will always be sharing the lives of people who've never been featured anywhere before and have had no interest in being celebrated for their stories. In fact, I have two coming up in the next few months that I'm really excited to share with you. That will always be my preference. But like I said, just because someone has developed a platform around their story, I don't think that they should be penalized for having done so. A good story is a good story. I don't think you will ever leave Lessons from Living not being motivated or inspired. At least I certainly hope that is the case. And that is, after all, the ultimate goal. Other observations, I'm thinking back over 100 episodes. I used the phrase body of work earlier, and it really is. When you look at it as a whole, it makes me think about doing things incrementally on a regular basis and how it can be so surprising in the results that you end up with. Sometimes I think we take that for granted and we're not willing to put in the regular kind of small steps that are required to end up with something that can be considered a long term, consistent, cohesive product. I'd like to do another episode on this topic in the future because I think it's really important. Another thing that I've been ruminating about lately are voices and what voices tell us. When I started podcasting, there were not many podcasts who were putting out video products. The video podcasting is really something that is fairly recent, and now it seems like everyone is trying to have a podcast in a video form, and by the way, we do. We are on YouTube. We're working steadily to get all of our episodes on there that we have video for, but in listening back to some of the earliest episodes, it occurs to me just how important a voice is and how I kind of love that about podcasting. I like hearing a voice isolated so that we are thinking about what the intonations are and the personality behind the voice and what that tells us about that individual. We tend to develop a picture of the person in our mind's eye, even as we are listening to their isolated voice. I love that about podcasting. I think we tend to want everything at once now and desire to just be submerged by the distraction of sound and video and imagery all at once. That is our life, right? That is social media. That is the things that we watch on TV. And I've had some listeners say, I really just want to see what this guest looks like. I think that's so funny. And ultimately, that is why we decided to try to put some videos on YouTube because I also appreciate that inclination. But I do think, and I will always believe, that there is something beautiful about the singularity of a voice and just what that voice speaks to us about the person who wields it. Thinking about 100 episodes, I consider how difficult it is to keep going in a project like this. I appreciate why the vast majority of podcasters never hit this milestone. It's a relatively small percentage of podcasters or programs that actually reach 100 episodes. I truly understand why it's so hard. I've lived it. I think Simon Sinek originally came up with a concept of having a big why, and it's discussed so much now that it's become almost cliche. But it's truly important for a project like this to focus on your original reason for pursuing the work. If you are set on having big numbers right out of the gate, and your goal is to have this huge following, and that is the only reason why you are doing something like this, unless you are some famous person before you ever step up to a mic, the chances of that happening for you are so remote. So you see everybody and their brother, that's actually true for Michelle Obama, isn't it? Starting a podcast these days, and they step into it. I think believing that this is going to be fun. This is so easy. There's not a whole lot to do. All you have to do is talk, and there's not a whole lot of work to be done. But that's just not reality. It's actually a lot of work, and it is very difficult to stay with a project like this, especially when you are not getting the results that you may really long for. This is a good spot for me to take a moment to acknowledge my assistant of the past 2 years. You might have heard me talk about Roy. He was hired to work on social media and help me with staying organized and staying on schedule. And he has done all of those things beautifully. But the most important thing that Roy has done is keep me motivated and continued to place that vision before our eyes that this was a worthwhile project and that it was worthy of giving time and attention to over the course of many years. I can just about promise you that if Roy had not come into my life 2 years ago, I would not have continued this work. Wouldn't have happened. There's something about working with another human toward a common goal that is so incredibly motivating. And he has been key to keeping me in this work and reaching some level of success. So thank you, Roy. Also, while I'm thanking, there are a number of you listeners who have been so faithful and so incredibly encouraging. I think you know who you are, but you also have been instrumental in keeping this work ongoing. So thank you. Okay, and thinking about success, what does that look like in this space like podcasting? Well, as I mentioned before, many people would not be satisfied with putting out a good product and doing so in a consistent manner without big numbers and sponsorships and recognition. Those things have never been the goal of podcasting for me. I wanted to tell the stories and glorify God in the process. After hiring Roy and other precious people, I've had more interest in developing sponsorships just so I can pay these friends what they're worth. So at this point, I certainly would not turn away help in that regard. But something that I did want to see always was solid and consistent growth. We spent a couple of years feeling like we were speaking into the void, and that's a really hard place to be. It's hard to do the work necessary to produce something like this when you don't know if the message will ultimately reach ears. And it also felt like a disservice to my guests to not know with confidence that their message was getting out. So that is what we prayed for, what we wanted, and we have had steady and predictable growth. By the way, this is another way that you can help. If this podcast has meant something to you, if you have enjoyed what we have produced, I encourage you, I plead with you to share it with a friend. I feel like we're covering every possible call to action in this episode, but this is the episode to do it in. Truly, the other thing that is so key to the continued success of the podcast is rating and reviewing the podcast on iTunes and Spotify. Those are the two places you can do it now. It doesn't seem like it would be a big deal, but those 5-star ratings help so much to get the podcast shared and distributed. So thank you to those of you who have done it already. And the rest of you, if you would take the time to do that, it would be so helpful. Our goal is to continue this good work. And as I said, the main things that keep us motivated to do this work is having that continued growth and seeing that it's making a difference in people's lives. One more thing I love is hearing from you, communicating with us to let us know that you have been touched by an episode or an episode has made you think about something differently. Even if you disagree with what we covered in an episode, hearing from you is so motivating. I can't tell you what your comments have meant to keep us motivated to continue this work. You can email me directly at beth@lessonsfromliving.net, and I will treasure every comment. I think at some point too, it would be fun to have a community where we can just kind of gather and chat about things. I think that's so important in today's world where this idea of centering around a community, there's just a lot of lonely people out there, and that would be something I would really like to incorporate into this work. I pray that this podcast has come to mean something to you, that it has indeed manifested the original vision by inspiring and motivating you. And most importantly, I hope that it has glorified God. It was never my intention to be a faith based podcast, but it's kind of crazy that so many people who have endured adversity and risen above trials in their lives have done so through faith. And so while I do not seek out only faith based stories, they are often so intertwined with these stories of successful living that Lessons from Living has often been considered a faith based podcast. I love that we have listeners from all different religions and different countries. I love that not all of our listeners are believers because God is working in their lives in different ways. And we want everyone to be gathered here together, no matter your belief system. God will find a way to work in your life through the stories that we share. And most importantly, I want you to know how grateful I am that you have put your trust in me and this podcast, and that you are willing to give your time and energy to listening on a regular basis. I've said before that you are the reason we do this work. I truly mean that. I would not do this work if it were not meaningful to you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for being there over the course of 100 episodes and some years now. And I look forward to sharing and investing in our friendship over many more episodes. May God bless you, my friend. We are going to leave today with words from Yo-Yo Ma. What a great name. When you learn something from people or from a culture, you accept it as a gift, and it is your lifelong commitment to preserve it and build on it. Thank you, Yo-Yo Ma, for that. Thank you for being with me today, friends. I love you. Truly, I do. And I hope that you go out and make it a great day.